How's everybody doing? That's some orange enthusiasm. Well, for the vibe today, Vijay, I want to make sure that we open this up for people who are still on the 101 level, but I also just want to set the tone for the day. And yesterday I was sitting at our Airbnb and wondering what it was that we could bring to this conference. How could we show up? What's the best version of ourselves that could show up and teach about this technology? And I looked down at our patio furniture, and as if the universe opened up to me, the label on the cushion said Orange Casual. So today, the official vibe of Bitcoin is for everyone is Orange Casual. Eddie, you don't have to do it next year, but for this year, it's Orange Casual. So we've got Vijay next to me. Vijay's written a book called The Bullish Case for Bitcoin. He's a passionate educator. He's been talking about this far longer than I have. And I'm going to do my best to make sure that his message gets across to you all. But to our listeners today, we're going to start out with some of the essential qualities of money. And we're going to lay the foundation. There's several qualities of money that many of you are aware of: durability, scarcity, portability, divisibility, fungibility. Anybody have the other two? Immutability. What's the other one? There we go. Saleability. We're going to focus on three for this chat. So we're going to talk about scarcity, we're going to talk about portability, and we're going to talk about durability. So, Vijay, can you talk to me about what portable money means to you and your family?
Yes. Well, firstly, thank you for having me at the conference. Thank you, Eddie, for organizing. I don't get down to Portland as much as I would like to, and this has to be the coolest venue of any conference I've been to. I think this is awesome. I hope you continue to organize this conference. For those of us in the Pacific Northwest who love the Pacific Northwest, it would be really cool to continue this. So portability, I have a story from when I was a kid. I grew up in Australia, and when I was a kid in junior high school, my mum got very sick. And my dad kind of freaked out. He didn't have his support network, his family around him in Australia, and he wanted to move my sister and I back to India where he had his family. And he had built up savings and assets in Australia over the decade or so he had lived in Australia. But there wasn't an easy way of getting those assets to India. India didn't really have a functioning banking system at the time. So what did my dad do? He sold all of his assets in Australia and he bought gold. He bought a bunch of gold bars, and he put them in a bag, which he tied to his leg. And I vividly remember as a kid flying to India with my family and the stress on my dad's face as he carried his wealth, his lifetime savings in a bag, and went through customs in India, which the customs agents in India are incredibly corrupt. So it's a very scary experience if you're holding anything valuable. And eventually he got his wealth to India and was able to convert it, and then he bought some real estate in India. So it worked out. This primed me when I came across Bitcoin to understand why Bitcoin is so much superior to what I call its closest cousin, which is gold. The ability to transport wealth across the world without anyone's permission as easily as sending an email is revolutionary. It's never been possible before. And I liken this to having gold with teleportation built in. So this is, in terms of portability, this is like a 10x improvement over gold or more. And I think this is one of the big factors that plays into Bitcoin's growing adoption, is that people understand this. They see that they can take their wealth wherever they want without anyone's permission. And that's a really freedom promoting technology to have. So I think portability is one of the strongest attributes for Bitcoin.
We talk about portability, and really Bitcoin is the apex of portability, right? Because it's an information product. So not only is it easy to carry, it's the easiest thing you could carry because it doesn't have any kind of physical mass. So even 10x, call it 1,000x better than anything physical that you're trying to hold wealth with. But not only that, you and I both came from a kind of early life perspective of seeing gold as money and seeing gold as a very worthwhile store of value. But even gold has an inflation rate, and just as of a few weeks ago, this last halving, we now have the hardest asset in the world by annual inflation supply. So can you talk a little bit about what scarcity means to you in terms of Bitcoin and comparing it to gold?
So there are various attributes that make for a good money, and these have been known for a very long time, since Aristotle. And you talked about them in the beginning, but I think the most important attribute of a good money is scarcity. That's where money gets its original value from. Humans have this innate desire to want to collect things which are scarce, and it's what gave us an evolutionary advantage over Neanderthals, that we had this desire to collect random stuff, but that gave us the ability to transfer value through time. Bitcoin gives us for the first time an asset with ultimate scarcity, that there will never be more than 21 million Bitcoins, and this is something that is truly unique to Bitcoin that we've never seen before. Even gold, which is very, very difficult to produce, has an inflation schedule, as you said. And the inflation schedule is quite low, but with technological improvements, it could grow at some point in the future. We could have asteroid mining, as crazy as that sounds, which could dramatically increase the supply of gold. I will give credit to gold in one sense. Its inflation schedule is non-political, and that's what makes gold superior to fiat money, is that you can rely on the fact that some politician doesn't press a button and double the supply of money. And that's what made gold money for most of human history. But now we have something superior. We have ultimate scarcity, which gives you a tremendous incentive. If you think, as I do, that people will recognize that Bitcoin has the attributes that make it ideal money, adoption's going to grow. And when the supply is fixed, adoption growing means one thing: number go up. And this creates a huge incentive that people have understood since the beginning of Bitcoin. Hal Finney, wrote about this pretty extensively. If Bitcoin becomes the global reserve currency, its value in terms of US dollars will be, many, many fold higher than it is now. You're talking about tens of millions of dollars per Bitcoin. So that, combined with all the freedom promoting attributes of Bitcoin, the fact that it has this incentive scheme built into it, the number go up incentive scheme, is a very, very powerful combination. So scarcity, I think, is the most important attribute of Bitcoin. It makes it completely unique in the world, and combined with its portability, it makes it a very desirable thing to have in your sort of savings or asset mix.
I completely agree. And, just the fact, I mean, you said gold is a non-political inflationary schedule, right? But it still inflates at a decent clip. I mean, in the 40s, there was half as much above ground gold as exists today, which is significant if it's what you're storing your wealth in. And the fact of Bitcoin having a truly finite supply, I mean, that's a discovery in itself. We've never had anything that we've created or discovered that actually has a verifiably finite supply that's enforced by law, that's written into code. It's such a profound evolution on even what we build our world with. There's nothing else. Even the scarcest of things there's still more of them, right? There's no sense of that in Bitcoin.
Right, and it also produces, if we eventually get to a world, as I believe, which will be on a Bitcoin standard, it produces a world with a deflationary money, in the sense that people will start to see the price of goods decrease over time, which is fantastic. We are used to this in certain sectors of the economy because they're so innovative and so productive, like technology sector. We expect that things get better and cheaper over time. But in most sectors of the economy, that's not the case, and things get more expensive, and it's painful, and people can't keep up. So to live in a world where prices decrease over time would be fantastic, and it creates this tremendous incentive to save. And the benefit of people saving more rather than consuming is it increases the pool of savings, which are then available for investment. So we will have a society with a lot more investment, a lot more productivity, and just a lot more prosperity under a Bitcoin standard.
And we've lived in societies something like that in the past, right? When there were gold standards, we did see quality of life improve, more savings come into people's households. I mean, can you talk a little bit about what we've already seen happens to societies when they've got hard money?
So the world was under the classical gold standard in the 19th century, and that was the period in human history which saw the greatest flourishing in human welfare in all of history. The the improvement in the lot of the average man increased and woman increased more than it ever has. People went from, fairly abject poverty across the world to global trade, to having a single money which they could trade across the globe. And living standards just increased tremendously in the 19th century. So I expect that we'll have a new renaissance under a Bitcoin standard. And I'm looking forward to that happening in my lifetime and improving the lives of my 4 young children.
Amen, brother. What do you think about, because I know your background is as a software engineer, it was absolutely a mind-blowing prospect to me when I realized that there's nothing less killable than distributed open source software. You talk about how Bitcoin being run on a system of nodes keeps it anti-fragile, keeps it durable long into the future versus something that's physical like gold, which we all cherish because of how long it seems to last through history. You can find it in shipwrecks 100 feet under the sea, and it's in the same condition it was when it went under. Talk about durability in Bitcoin's sense.
Yeah, durability is a really interesting attribute to talk about when you talk about Bitcoin, because with gold, it's easy to understand, right? It's a physical object and it's durable in the sense it's very difficult to destroy gold. It doesn't rust. It has these nice properties that last, a very long time. And the gold from the time of the pharaohs and the Romans still exists today. So that makes sense to most people. What does durability mean for Bitcoin? It really boils down to the durability of the network. How durable is the network? How easy is it to kill the Bitcoin network? And this is an open question. Bitcoin's only been around for, say, 15 years now, but it's displayed properties of immense anti-fragility. It has weathered all kinds of attacks from companies, hackers, nation states, and yet it continues to persist. And it's the decentralized nature of Bitcoin that allows this. There's no single point of failure where you can go and attack a company or you can attack a particular person and kill Bitcoin. I mean, there's potentially one way to really harm Bitcoin, which is to try and shut down the entire internet. But that's beyond even nation states, because it would be a death blow to themselves. So they don't have the ability to do something which would harm themselves.
And you'd have to keep it shut off forever.
Yes, exactly right. So this is it's incredibly unlikely, and just it is its decentralized nature, and the perfect balance of incentives that Satoshi created, so that there's no one group which has enough power to co-opt Bitcoin. And we really learnt this in 2017 with the block size wars, where there are a number of companies and very prominent individuals who held a lot of Bitcoin, and the most powerful miners who did try to co-opt Bitcoin and change it to benefit their purpose, and they were unable to do this. And to me, that was like the great test of Bitcoin's resilience, and that was the point at which I felt like this thing is inevitable in the sense that it cannot be killed. Whether it becomes the world's reserve currency or not, I think it will. That's an open question, but I think Bitcoin has proven that it's essentially impossible to kill.
BJ, why do you get up in the morning to teach about this?
I'm a nerd. I mean, that's what really, my interest in money and economics was the first thing that got me fascinated about Bitcoin. I'm a software engineer, and a computer scientist, so I find it fascinating that Satoshi solved a problem that most people did not think was possible to solve. I find that fascinating as well. And I think now, as a dad, it's for my kids. I want a better world. I'm sure there are a lot of parents in here who have kids, and you want to see the world be a better place for future generations. And I truly believe a world under a Bitcoin standard would be a much better place, much more prosperous, much less prone to wars, a world with a neutral monetary base, not a political one, a monetary base that's not controlled by any particular country. And this is, an aspiration that Charles de Gaulle had after World War II, that the world re-standardize on a neutral monetary base, and that no particular nation had exorbitant privilege, as he called it. He thought that that would be gold. Unfortunately, gold has a number of drawbacks which Bitcoin has much improved upon. And so I think in the future we're going to move to a Bitcoin standard. And this period that we live in right now, I consider it a historical anomaly. It's the fiat money interregnum. It's the period between the gold standard and the Bitcoin standard, which is the norm of human history, to live under a hard money standard where people can keep their savings in something that doesn't lose its value or can be debased.
Do you find it more compelling that Satoshi solved a problem that most people don't understand the problem and also don't understand the solution that came for it?
It's interesting that people take money for granted, that money is the foundation of all trade and savings. It's the most important economic good in any society. And most people just take it for granted. And in the US, money sort of seems to work. I think people are starting to have an inkling that something's wrong. Why are prices going up so quickly? There are many nations where people do not have that same, they do not take money for granted in the same way. Go to Zimbabwe, go to Venezuela, go to Argentina. These countries, people know what it's like to live with a broken money. I have a friend from Argentina, and he told me a story from when he was a kid. You'd go to the grocery store, and they had someone who changed prices, and they would go down the aisle, and they'd change prices, and they'd get to the last aisle, and then they would go back to the beginning and change prices again, because prices were moving that quickly, and if they didn't change prices, they would lose money. They would lose value. That's broken money, and we are not immune from that. So I think it behooves people to think about this. The United States is certainly not immune. We've been on a fiat standard only for about 40 years. This is a giant experiment, and we are the guinea pigs. So I think it really behooves all of us to speak to people and explain why a sound money standard would benefit all of us.
It's definitely more subtle here, right? If you equate us to the lobsters in the pot, the water's getting warmer a little bit slower in the US. It's a little bit harder maybe to tell that you were in the wrong spot. All the more important, though, that you do the work to recognize it and see what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. It does take some work. Understanding Bitcoin is not easy or obvious. I will grant that. And I think that means we're getting close to time. That's the harsh reminder. Um, it it does take a lot of effort to understand Bitcoin. But I got a piece of advice very early on that I think is important to share with folks, which is don't understand Bitcoin, then start saving in it. Start saving in it and then understand it, because you'll have the financial incentive. And even if it's a very small fraction of your assets, maybe 1%, that's the right way to go. This is a world-changing technology. It's as important, I think more important than the internet. So put in the work, but start accumulating Bitcoin now.
What do you think is on the other side? Because you talked about price changes in countries like Argentina, where you're going into the grocery store and someone's going through and just raising the prices as you look at them. How do you think it's going to change the psychology of people when they go into a grocery store on a Bitcoin standard and prices get lower every day?
I think it's the same psychology that you have with technology, right? You expect things to get better. It's a very hopeful psychology. The funny thing is economists tend to think this is disastrous, which, that tells you, how much credibility you should assign to economists. That prices going down is bad because, oh my goodness, people are going to start saving, they're never going to spend, and the economy is going to explode. No, the fact that the price of, the technology improves with iPhones, for instance, doesn't mean that I'm just going to wait forever to buy an iPhone. I'm not going to wait 10 years because there is benefit to buying it. There's utility in the moment. So economies are not going to explode under a deflationary money. It's just going to be better. We can expect that things improve over time. And that's a really hopeful message, as opposed to the world we live in now, where things decrease, the value of our money decreases over time, and it becomes harder to purchase things, and you're forced to go out there and gamble to make sure that your money keeps pace with inflation. That to me is a message of despair, and also a message of immorality. It forces people to live an immoral life, to dissipate their savings and gamble, and to spend much more than they should, as opposed to a world in which people are thinking about the future and they want to save because the value of their savings increase over time.
That's a grocery store where I think I would look you in the eye and smile.
Absolutely.
Grocery stores are one place where we might see Bitcoin impact things, but I mean, coming from the mining side, I know that this also transcends to the physical world, that we have an impact on energy systems. What are some other kind of downstream impacts that you see on our world from Bitcoin becoming more and more of something that people pay attention to, is integrated into their lives? Other than just smiling and shaking each other's hands in the grocery store, what kind of life do we have to look forward to because Bitcoin is a thing?
One thing Satoshi didn't anticipate, which I think is really interesting, is the impact that Bitcoin is going to have on energy grids. And I think it's going to unlock the potential for renewable energy in all sorts of places around the world that when people never would have thought of developing. Because now you have this ability to monetize energy that's stranded. You could have a volcano somewhere. All you need to mine Bitcoin is a good energy source and an internet connection. And so what will happen is that you'll start seeing miners set up in locations which are otherwise uneconomic to develop. And those will become areas around the world that people will start moving to because there'll be a financial incentive, there'll be a technology center, and there'll be cheap renewable energy. And that's what you need for the basis of civilization, is that you need cheap energy. So that, I think, is going to have profound impact on the globe in the next few decades.
I love the refrain that Bitcoin is a pioneer species, because it really paints the picture of something that goes into an uninhabitable environment, that uses the resources that no other organism can make really good use of, and creates a habitable environment for everything that comes after it, just by being the first to go into these environments. And you're right, it's profound, because energy is the underpinning of what we as people use every day for our regular lives. I mean, if we didn't have energy, most people in this room would be freaking out. If you can't charge your phone, it's the end of the world for most of us in Western civilization. Imagine not having refrigeration or light after dark. The fact that we can go in and, through a few lines of code released 15 years ago, create a system of incentives that brings energy to places where it otherwise never would have been used or utilized, is something that I never saw coming. I didn't see that coming years ago, and I'm just flabbergasted to watch it happen in real time.
Yeah, I would just comment that I think Bitcoin is the most profoundly positive technology ever invented if you're an environmentalist. The narrative that was being peddled for the last few years that Bitcoin is bad for the environment is exactly the opposite of the truth. Once you understand what Bitcoin makes possible in the incentive structure, I think you'll see that Bitcoin, if you're environmentalist, you should really be promoting Bitcoin as a technology that allows the development of renewable technologies around the world.
Any final thoughts, Vijay? We've talked a lot about broad-reaching impacts of Bitcoin. We've laid some foundations of what this technology is. Is there anything that you want to open up the day for the rest of our speakers to make sure that the people in the audience have a foundational understanding of some of the things we're going to talk about today?
Good question. I think, one of the things that people ask me is, am I too late to Bitcoin? I get that question all the time. And I think we are so early. Global adoption of Bitcoin is maybe in the single digit percentages, maybe 2 or 3% of the globe has adopted Bitcoin. So I think we're still very, very early in this story. And I don't think we even understand how Bitcoin is going to change the world. We have a sort of inkling, but it's the same feeling of, I was getting out of college in the late 90s, and people were trying to figure out how would the internet change the world. And this was prior to smartphones, prior to Facebook, YouTube, Google Maps, all of these things that we use every day now. And people didn't really have an idea how it would change the world. But I think if you fast forward 10 years from the late 90s to 2009, 2010, it started to become clear. And I have a sense that in the next decade, it's going to start to become clear how Bitcoin is going to change the world, how it's going to change the financial system, and how it's going to affect individual lives. So I'm really excited to see what happens in the next 10 years.
Do you think there's any other useful analogies relating back to the internet that people can draw on? I mean, I've heard it compared to us being in the internet in 95, 97. Some people talk about us still being in the 80s, where we're still developing early stage protocols. I mean, how can you how can you frame where we are for people today? Because you're right, we're still early. Already changing the world in a big way through this technology, but it's got 99+% of the room to run still to its total addressable market and total addressable impact. Where do you think we are?
Yeah, I do think we're sort of, if to use that analogy, I still think we're in the 90s. I think one thing that's interesting is, when do people start believing that Bitcoin is a permanent institution in the world? With the internet, I think people didn't really have that sense until at least 20 or 20 plus years after the internet was really starting to get adopted. So I feel like when you get to that point with Bitcoin, you get a whole generation of people who've grown up with Bitcoin being something that's been there and existed as part of their lives. And for them, it's a permanent institution in the world. So I feel like that's going to be a big transition when people sort of see this isn't going away. This is a new thing that makes possible things that have never been possible before. The ability to transport your wealth anywhere on earth without anyone's permission. That's kind of, I think, an important tipping point. That's the tipping point where you have a new generation who's like, this will be part of our lives forever, and we're going to take it for granted. And that's, taking a world in which people take Bitcoin as something that exists for granted, as opposed to fiat money taking it for granted, is a very hopeful world.
I agree with you. And you talk about there's maybe a percentage point of people who have adopted the technology, who have a wallet somewhere in some amount sitting, but the percentage of people who have made this their living standard, that have turned this into their base money, the most of their wealth that they store, is far fewer than a percent. I mean, the amount of people who are as irresponsibly long as I'm sure we both are is still quite small compared to what this is. But there are people who are already living that way, just as there were early adopters to the internet who were, programming and interacting with protocol level languages long before any of us ever touched a computer. There's people who are leading the way in what this looks like integrated into your life. And I'm just excited to see the type of people that come out of studying, integrating this technology, and really living the lifestyle that comes along with a money that can't be debased, that's truly yours, that you control. It's the best that's ever been.
I agree.
Well, before we get into Q&A, I just want to say, Vijay, it is such a gift to have you here. I'm really appreciative of all the education you do. Your book, I know, has impacted many lives and is going to continue to impact many more. And just the fact that you would come to Portland and chat with me and help teach the locals in Oregon what Bitcoin is, why it's so important, it's such a gift. So everybody, could we give Vijay a round of applause, please? Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. We're ready to open up for question and answer. Anybody's got questions for Vijay? Any questions about Bitcoin 101, properties of money?
I wanted to ask you how Bitcoin is going to scale. We said we have maybe 1 or 2% of people in the world using Bitcoin. How are we going to get that to more people, given Bitcoin's limited on-chain capacity?
This is a deep rabbit hole.
I know. But it's for everyone, and that's why we're here today.
This is actually a very controversial topic, and I know that there are people who have different opinions to me. I think the question asker may have a different opinion to me. I actually believe that Bitcoin does not need to scale at the base layer, and I am what you would call an ossification maximalist. I believe that what we have is so precious and so unique that there's a great danger to trying to tamper with it in any way. One way of thinking about this is, the transition from how much power developers in the Bitcoin ecosystem should have. In the early days, Satoshi had a lot of power, and there was one point he unilaterally changed Bitcoin and put in a block size limit. To 2017, where there was a debate, should we increase the block size or not, and should we adopt SegWit? And developers still had a lot of power. Ultimately, we don't want developers to have any power. We want this to be an immutable institution that is not tamperable, because if you have a lot of power in developers, what you get is Ethereum and essentially a technological version of the central banking system. So I'm of the belief that Bitcoin is precious. It's a value transfer protocol that cannot be tampered with, and we don't want to break that. I think that we will find solutions to scale Bitcoin, but we shouldn't be doing it at the base layer. So I know that's controversial, and I have a lot of respect for the people who have a different opinion on this, but that's the point of view, that's the message I want to spread, is that this is a precious thing, and we should be very, very careful about meddling with it.
Is there any nuance to that? Do you think that you can develop on the higher layers of the protocol as long as you're not touching core? Or do you have any kind of like, is there a place where you say, no more, you shouldn't be touching this?
Absolutely. I think we should be scaling. We should have all sorts of second layer solutions. I think a lot of people have become a little tied to Lightning as the solution for scaling Bitcoin. I don't know if Lightning is the solution. Lightning may be part of the solution, but I think there'll be a number of different solutions. Yeah, I don't believe that the risk reward ratio makes it worth tampering with at the base layer.
To take it back to Bitcoin 101, Vijay, I've read multiple books on what is money, why is money not working, whether it's Saifedean's The Bitcoin Standard, whether it's Nick Badia's Layered Money, and I've just recently received Lynn Alden's Broken Money. Which of those resources, or are there others at a more basic level, would you recommend for those that are new to Bitcoin to begin to understand why we have a money problem?
Well, thank you for the question. It almost feels planted. There's a book I wrote about Bitcoin. It covers those exact topics as you. So I appreciate the question. I have a few copies I brought down. I'm going to be selling. Come see me. I'll get you a signed copy of my book. I wrote the article which preceded in my book to explain to my mother, why does Bitcoin have any value? Because in 2017 I was getting a lot of questions about that. And I think it's actually a difficult thing to understand. And you have to start with the question, why does money have any value? Once you understand why money has value, why Bitcoin has value sort of flows very naturally. And I cover that pretty extensively in my book. It's a short book. You could probably read it by the end of the day. And hopefully you find the information you need in that. Thank you for that question.
I gotta say, personally, orange pilling my mother was one of the most satisfying triumphs of my entire life. I don't know about you.
I'm still working on it.
So, Vijay, having orange pilled so many people, is there a good 2-minute pitch that kind of opens up people's minds to Bitcoin? Having failed quite a bit in doing this, so that's why I'm asking.
That's a good question, Ram. I think the most important thing is the person has to be receptive from the beginning. They have to already have that spark of curiosity. I've found that there's not really much point if a person is not curious. Everyone will get curious eventually because they'll hear about Bitcoin from enough people in their social circles that they'll be like, okay, what is this thing? I need to check it out. Same thing happened with the internet. But if you do see that curiosity, I think the right way to frame it really does vary from person to person. People have different things that they're interested in. I've seen people come to Bitcoin for all sorts of reasons, people from very, very different communities. But I would always bring it back to money, because money is half of every transaction in any developed economy, and people, have an attachment to money. It's the fruit of their labor. So getting them to understand what's wrong with money, because people get affected by things like inflation, right? Why is it that when I go to Costco, the price of a brisket is twice of what it was 3 or 4 years ago? That's really annoying for me. And so that would be a good hook in for me. And so finding that hook in for the person who is curious, I think it's a challenge. You have to figure it out on an individual basis.
To piggyback off of that, it's great to have an elevator pitch. It's great to have your prepared statement to get into someone's head. But ultimately, the best communicators are really good listeners. So you're typically going to have the most success if you hear where that person is coming from specifically, what their actual pain point is.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I was just wondering what your thoughts are, instead of doing the hard sell of moving people over into Bitcoin is, just trying to get them to buy like an ETF product just for some exposure. Just, sell it like an asset class like gold, just for diversification purposes. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's going to appeal to a lot of people. I think that the fact that Bitcoin is the best performing asset of the last decade is going to bring a lot of people in. And what I've seen in my history, meeting Bitcoiners, is that a lot of people get interested in Bitcoin just as an investment, and then they go down the rabbit hole of what Bitcoin is later on. They're like, wow, this is really cool. This is like a freedom promoting technology. And I've seen this enough times to know it's not a coincidence. I've seen this kind of individual transformation among people who save in Bitcoin. Once they understand what it is, that it's this asset of ultimate scarcity, they have this immediate desire, once that light bulb has gone off, to get as many Bitcoins as possible. And they start deferring purchases, and they start saving more, and they start thinking about the future more. And that's something I think is really cool, because I think it's transforming lives in a moral way as well. But I agree with you. I think, it's totally fine. I'm not against the ETFs. I think that's part of the financialization of Bitcoin, and I think they're going to be a very attractive product for a lot of people. And if you look at the history of the gold ETF and the, almost decade-long bull run that was triggered by the gold ETF being launched, I think we're going to see something very similar with the Bitcoin ETF. Actually, it's been the most successful ETF launch in history, so I think it's going to have a much bigger impact than the gold ETF had on gold's price.
It's regarding the durability and the authentication you mentioned earlier. So do you think quantum computing will ever be a threat? And if working quantum computer is created, do you think Bitcoin network can withstand that, or it need to be changed in some way?
Potentially, but quantum computing is one of those threats that's a known unknown. We know about it, and we know potentially how to fix Bitcoin. So it's not something I really worry about. I'm also not someone who thinks that quantum computing is around the corner. It's not going to just show up one day unexpected. If it did, we'd have other problems as well beyond Bitcoin. So I'm not really worried about that as a threat to Bitcoin. Yeah, I do sometimes worry about what the unknown unknowns are, but I think because Bitcoin's been around so long, we've probably figured out what most of those are.
This might be a larger topic. I'm personally a real estate guy, so this is a fascinating conversation for me to observe. But what you guys have described is something relatively similar to the internet and things like that, and how this is, transformational. And I think there is the chance that it could become transformational because it could depoliticize currencies, where because most of them are off the gold standard, now they're just political, more or less, fiat currencies, all of them. But if there's no internet, it breaks up the Bitcoin dialogue relatively quickly. And if there's no electricity, the same. Now, all of those can become decentralized and more or less survive on their own. But I think my concern is that you're describing this as a solution that could be a one-size-fits-all solution, but you've also described something that's hyper-deflationary. Now, it might be nice to get a TV that's $300 instead of $3,000, which sounds fantastic. But what happens when essentially you have other more tangible assets, and how do you integrate that in your day-to-day life instead of spending 10,000 Bitcoin on 2 pizzas, which I think is fantastic? You have the inverse. Instead of inflationary, you've got hyper-deflationary, which promotes you saving, which is fantastic, but it's supposed to be used as a medium of exchange. And so I think that there's some confusion for me, where I think there's a lot of promotion with regards to thinking of it as an asset instead of a tool, which theoretically a currency is supposed to be.
¿Por qué no los dos?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think under a Bitcoin standard, the world wouldn't be hyper deflationary; it would be mildly deflationary. It would actually be pretty similar to a gold standard, in my opinion. Gold had very mild inflation schedule, but prices decreased over time under a gold standard. The fact that Bitcoin's been hyper deflationary, like the cost of a pizza in terms of Bitcoin, has gone down dramatically, many orders of magnitude. And that's not what you'd expect with money. But once you get to global adoption where everyone has savings in Bitcoin, that hyperdeflation really slows down. The fact that the price is increasing so much is directly tied to adoption. And once you get global saturation, adoption sort of stops, right? And then the deflation comes from productivity increases. And then what you'd expect under a Bitcoin standard, I think, is a deflation rate of, 3 to 5% a year, whatever productivity is. And that definitely increases the incentive to save, but all it's doing is moving the equilibrium of how much people want to save slightly. It doesn't mean that people are going to stop consuming completely. Like, people are not going to be clutching their Bitcoin naked in a gutter because they don't want to spend it. I want a house, I want a car, I want, an iPhone. They will want to spend. It just shifts the incentive slightly, and it shifts the incentive to saving and increasing the pool of savings versus away from consumption. We live in a world where consumption is incentivized. So the Federal Reserve wants you to go and buy a new granite countertop for your house. Maybe you don't want to do that anymore because you've got a greater incentive to save. The economists will tell you this is disastrous. My belief is it just shifts the incentive structure slightly.
To piggyback off that a little bit, I think the medium of exchange conversation, the currency part of Bitcoin, is something that is more often talked about, but is less important now. The store value characteristic is, in my opinion, the use case that is the most important in our world today. And to the degree that we can work toward it being a global medium of exchange and it being a useful, fast transaction mechanism, great. That's a fantastic bonus. But the problem most people face in the world today, especially outside of our country, is the debasement of their wealth. So having a store of value is the main problem for most people to solve right now. In my opinion, the most important problem and the first problem. But I'd love it if everybody could open up their hearts and put their hands together for Mr. Vijay. Thank you so much for being with us, Vijay.